Is this weird? Greetings from the year 2019. Obviously, I'm on the moon, where Newt Gingrich is the president of the moon. How can anybody be president of the moon, you ask, from the past, where you live? Well, back when he was just candidate Gingrich, President Newt, that's what we call him, President Newt, he not only promised a permanent colony on the moon by the end of his second term, but he declared that that colony would be an American colony. He said once he figured out a way to get a few thousand Americans up here on the moon in our permanent colony here, the moon could then become the 51st state. And so now in 2019, Puerto Rico, I guess, is still just a territory. Washington, D.C. is essentially still like an occupied territory. But the moon, well, now we call it North Dakota. And Newt Gingrich is the first president of the moon. He's sort of our George Washington up here. Just because I'm wearing this fake costume spacesuit doesn't mean I'm kidding about this.
By the end of my second term, we will have the first permanent base on the moon, and it will be American. At one point early in my career, I introduced the Northwest Ordinance for space. And I said when we got, I think the number is 13,000. When we have 13,000 Americans living on the moon, they can petition to become a state. And I will, as president, encourage the introduction of the Northwest Ordinance for space to put a marker down that we want Americans to think boldly about the future, and we want Americans to go out and study hard and work hard, and together we're going to unleash the American people to rebuild the country we love.
Sorry, it's really hot inside this suit. I'm sorry. You know the stuff that President Gingrich was saying about him becoming president of the moon because the moon is going to be the 51st state? That was not his most ambitious idea about the moon. In one of the books that Newt Gingrich wrote as a member of Congress, a book called Window of Opportunity, he talked about how the moon could be put to work fighting crime. Now, come on, you say, how could the moon possibly fight crime? Mirrors! Mirrors that would be angled on the moon to reflect sunlight, I guess, back down to Earth to strategically eliminate some portions of night. Mitt Romney has been making fun of Newt Gingrich for this for a little bit over the course of the campaign, but Mother Jones today posted the actual excerpt from Newt's book where he explains the idea. It says, quote, ambient light covering entire areas could reduce the current danger of criminals lurking in darkness. Mirrors could be arranged to light given metropolitan areas only during particular periods, so there could be darkness late at night for sleeping. A couple of years after that book came out, and this was posted by BuzzFeed today, Mr. Gingrich proposed that not the moon, but space could be used for something related to farmers. In a speech to a World Science Fiction Convention, Congressman Gingrich said America could take what he called all the extra farmers and put them on space stations working for a living in orbiting factories. The AP then said that Gingrich lamented that most human beings will have to live and work on Earth until at least the year 2500. But candidate Gingrich, Congressman Gingrich, wanted to get to work on this farmers working on factories in orbit plan right away. Now, I don't know what the advantage is to having them working in factories that are in orbit rather than like in Michigan, but orbiting factories was Mr. Gingrich's idea. So Newt Gingrich, president of the moon. Cheers. Same as it ever was. It is not very hard to attack Newt Gingrich for grandiosity, even before he starts talking about being president of the moon. But the fact that he talks about stuff like this can make his trademark grandiosity seem not just pompous, but also sometimes a little right? A little wacky, a little maybe unstable. And that's pretty much the theme of the Romney campaign's new round of attacks against Mr. Gingrich. The Romney campaign forwarding to the conservative magazine The National Review today a statement from former Republican presidential candidate Bob Dole. Bob Dole says, quote, "I have not been critical of Newt Gingrich, but it is now time to take a stand before it is too late. Hardly anyone who served with Newt in Congress has endorsed him, and that fact speaks for itself. In my run for the presidency in 1996, the Democrats greeted me with a number of negative TV ads, and in every one of them, Newt was in the ad." So at this point, it's sort of the standard Newt would be a bad nominee, Newt would lose the election thing, until you get to this final crank from Bob Dole, and I do mean crank. He says, "Newt would show up at the campaign headquarters," says Bob Dole, "with an empty bucket in his hand. That was a symbol of some sort for him, and I never did know what he was doing or why he was doing it, and I'm not certain he knew either." Why was Newt Gingrich carrying a bucket in the 1996 presidential campaign? Wacky. Newt on the moon, right? The most notable thing, though, about the attacks on Newt Gingrich from the Republican establishment today, really the most notable thing about it, A, they're going with the wacky and unstable thing. But mostly, it's the magnitude of it. They just piled on. For example, just look at the Drudge Report today. I had not been there for ages, but looking at it today is remarkable. Drudge is essentially the Republican homepage. You know how Republican TVs mostly just have one channel, Fox News? Republican internet machines have only one web page, the Drudge Report. Look at Drudge today. It's one thing to have the main headline be an anti-Gingrich headline. In this case, I have to say it's kind of rich that they're going after Gingrich for having uncertain ties to Ronald Reagan, when Mitt Romney has this uncertain tie to Ronald Reagan on his record.
Look, I was an independent during the time of Reagan-Bush. I'm not trying to return to Reagan-Bush.
Put aside for the moment that the whole Newt's no Reaganite thing is not that effective an attack for people who support Mitt Romney. But beyond that, just appreciate here the number of anti-Gingrich stories and the unanimity of the anti-Gingrich perspective here, right? Look, Insider, Gingrich repeatedly insulted Reagan. Gingrich opens door for illegals. Gingrich admits his ABC claim was false during debate. Gingrich tells Univision no perjury during my divorce depositions. Marianne Gingrich lawyer. Gingrich was never deposed. Again, this is basically the Republican Party's homepage. Newt Gingrich is a Republican candidate for president, the leading one. In addition to trucking out old Bob Dole today, there was also this from former Ronald Reagan staffer Elliot Abrams, quote, "Newt Gingrich spewed insulting rhetoric at Reagan. He was dead wrong." The American Spectator conservative magazine calling Newt Gingrich today our Bill Clinton, describing Mr. Gingrich as having a, quote, "proclivity for girl hopping." Ew. The editors of another conservative magazine, The National Review, writing that Gingrich backers say he is inspiring, but, quote, "what he mostly seems to inspire is opposition." Tom DeLay, of all people, remember the guy with the smiling mugshot? Tom DeLay was on talk radio yesterday calling Newt Gingrich, quote, "erratic and not really a conservative." Mr. DeLay also calling Mr. Gingrich undisciplined. Politico.com today, quoting an anonymous top conservative media figure as saying, "There's no one who's not appalled by the prospect of what could happen if Mr. Gingrich wins the nomination. It could happen, and it would be a disaster. There's just so much risk on so many levels." Risk. There's that idea again, right? He's crazy. Anything could happen. The Republican establishment is essentially rearing up on its hind legs to try to destroy Newt Gingrich right now. Now, Mr. Gingrich does have his supporters, prominent supporters. Sarah Palin has been sort of a lukewarm Newt Gingrich supporter. Fred Thompson says that he likes Newt. Duke Cunningham, speaking of mugshots, Duke Cunningham is still in prison for corruption in California, but Duke Cunningham now says that he's for Newt Gingrich, too, from prison. But, you know, that right there is kind of the pitiful counter-arsenal that Newt Gingrich has against the Republican establishment. In a normal year, an imbalance like that, the whole establishment versus the guy in prison and the reverse mortgage guy and Sarah Palin, that would mean that Mr. Gingrich's campaign would pretty much be dead in the water. That imbalance would be fatal. But this year, do not underestimate the importance of the fact that Newt Gingrich has money on tap. $10 million in donations for his super PAC so far from one couple in Las Vegas. A couple so rich that they could make that same $10 million donation 500 more times, and they would still be billionaires. So Mitt Romney may be rolling out all of these surrogates and supporters, but Newt Gingrich doesn't need all that. A, he's got all the money he wants, and B, he can take care of himself. In between contemplating being president of the moon in Florida today, Mr. Gingrich really went in on Mitt Romney.
We were drowned in a sea of mud in Iowa. Mud paid for with special interest money, mud paid for by lobbyists in Washington, and a candidate who was willing to say anything and do anything because he's so desperate to be president, he doesn't think the truth matters. We're not going to beat Barack Obama with some guy who has Swiss bank accounts, Cayman Island accounts, owns shares of Goldman Sachs while it forecloses on Florida, and is himself a stockholder in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, while he tries to think the rest of us are too stupid to put the dots together and understand what this is all about.
Wow. Newt Gingrich may have the whole Republican establishment lined up against him, but here's the thing. He doesn't need their money, and Republican voters may be in an anti-establishment kind of mood. Thank you very much. Republican voters are not in love with Mitt Romney, no matter how much the establishment is. And frankly, what Newt Gingrich is saying there about Mitt Romney maybe not being such a safe bet for Republicans, maybe not being a good guy to put up against Barack Obama, Newt Gingrich kind of has a point there. NBC's Michael Isikoff reporting today that Mitt Romney had more money stashed away in offshore accounts than he had previously disclosed. So Mr. Romney is now having to go back and change what he declared when he became a candidate, both this time and from the 2008 race. He's having to change his candidate disclosures to reflect this previously hidden offshore money that has now been found. Joining us now with some new reporting on Mitt Romney's overseas investments is NBC News national investigative correspondent Michael Isikoff, who will absolutely forgive me the fact that I'm interviewing him in a fake spacesuit. Mike, thanks.
I'm honored. This is the first time I've ever had a chance to report to a space woman, so it's really good to be with you.
We come in peace.
Yes, some pretty interesting developments. You know, the Romney campaign had been thrown on the defensive by those Gingrich super PAC attack ads on Bain Capital and his wealth, and was forced to make this big disclosure this week of his tax returns months before they wanted to. And so, of course, everybody has started to scrutinize those hundreds of pages of tax returns released. And one of the things that we discovered was that there's income reported in those tax returns that were not disclosed in the financial disclosure form that Romney filed with the Federal Ethics Office just last year. And in particular, one leapt out, the Swiss bank account, about $3 million in it at UBS, opened for the Romneys in 2003, and then shut down in early 2010. And yet there is $1,783 in income reported from that Swiss bank account on the Ann Romney Blind Trust. You don't see it in the financial disclosure form. Confronted with this today, the Romney people said they were going to amend this minor discrepancy, as well as include some other offshore investments in Cayman Islands and Bermuda that, in the same situation, are mentioned, reported in the tax returns, but not in the financial disclosure.
So in terms of the big picture here, what you're saying is that funds, bank accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands and these other places weren't on Mitt Romney's candidate disclosure filings. They should have been. We didn't find out about them until now. But had he properly reported what his actual assets were, we would have known that he was offshoring some of his money, or at least some of his family's money, when he ran for president in 2008. We would have known this last year.